Hello, everybody, and welcome to this exam walkthrough session. This will be for the paper 2 period study on superpower relations in the Cold War. So we will go through an example of each type of question, how to break it down, look at some model answers, and explain why each one is a model answer. This is very similar to what we do in the actual recordings, but sometimes it's nice just to have the paper, the whole paper, and just go through that as one whole unit. Okay, so let's go ahead and begin. Let me just put this in full screen mode. There we go. Okay. So let's look at, first of all, just to remind you how paper 2 is structured. If you have gone through this module on superpower relations in the Cold War, and of course, with this exam unit or exam walkthrough, you have only done half of paper 2. There are 2 studies in paper 2. There is your period study and your British depth study. Okay, so we've done the period study with this one. This is your what they call the P paper, P4. You still have your British depth study to do. Currently, as of the recording of this video, the plan is to do Anglo-Saxon and Norman England as the British depth study. Ideally, as we get moving on, I would like to do a lot more options so students have more choice. But anyway, we want to get a full GCSE up there. Okay, so that's how paper 2 is structured. You have to pick 2 of these. You cannot pick 2 of the P options or 2 of the B options. You have to pick a B and a P option. Right now, your options are limited. There's only going to be one available. But as we start making more of these available, we'll release some videos on that, on making your selections. Okay, so this is sort of the front of the booklet, what you will see on exam day. This was obviously, this is one of the more recent ones, June 4th, 2024. You have an hour and 45 minutes, but that is to complete both booklets. So you'll get 2 separate booklets. You'll get this one, which is obviously for the superpower relations, the P period study. You will get a separate booklet for the other one. You will get 1 hour and 45 minutes to complete both of them. Just grabbing a bottle of water. Okay, so what we're going to do today is we are just going to do the period study questions. When we do the depth study, we will do a separate exam walkthrough for that one. I thought about waiting until the end, but I thought no, it would be best to do one for each. Okay, so the first type of question that you're going to have is an explain to consequence question. So the example we have here is explain 2 consequences of the Prague Spring in Czechoslovakia in 1968. So you'll have things as consequence 1, consequence 2, and you just explain them. The best way to do it is your peel paragraphs. So first of all, you need to understand, explain. You're not just defining, you're not describing, you have to explain. So this means you must identify a consequence. So what happened, something that happened as a result of the Prague Spring, why it happened and how it happened. Show the impact or the result. Do not just describe the Prague Spring. You need to talk about the impact of the Prague Spring. Okay, you need 2 clear consequences. So you must write 2 separate paragraphs, 1 consequence per paragraph. So don't just think you're going to write one stellar paragraph and get all 8 marks. You're not. Good consequences of the Prague Spring would include increased Soviet control over Eastern Europe, the introduction of the Brezhnev Doctrine, loss of independence in Czechoslovakia. Remember, they went through a little period of relaxed communism after the Prague Spring. No. Increased fear and repression across the Eastern Bloc. Only have to choose 2 of those or come up with another one. Again, like I said, you should use the P or the peel structure. Each paragraph should follow the structure. Point, identify the consequence. Evidence, you need some kind of evidence, a date, a place, a name. You would explain how the Prague Spring caused this consequence. Develop it further if you want to, the impact or the importance, and what happened and why. Okay, so paragraph 1, you will identify a consequence. This is a good structure. Explain how it fit and links into the Prague Spring and the wider impact or significance. Paragraph 2, you'll do a different consequence, but you'll pretty much follow the same format, clear explanation, and develop the impact. Okay, so what we have here. Consequence 1, we chose for the first one, increased Soviet control over Eastern Europe. Okay, so here's our point in green. One consequence of the Prague Spring was that the Soviet Union increased its control over Eastern Europe. There you go, perfect. Now here's your evidence. In 1968, Alexander Dubček introduced reforms in Czechoslovakia, such as greater freedom of speech and reduced censorship, which threatened Soviet authority. So that is very good evidence. If you remember the SPEND, statistics, places, events, names, dates. Okay. You don't have to have all of it. You can just have one. But this has got more than one. This has got a date, it's got a person, Alexander Dubček, place, Czechoslovakia. Okay. Very good evidence. Now we want to explain that now. As a result, there's a very good key phrase there, as a result. So this happened as a result of Alexander Dubček's reforms. As a result, Soviet troops invaded Czechoslovakia to remove Dubček and end the reforms. Okay, so there's an explanation. Now we want to kind of link this back. What overall impact did this have? The USSR showed that the USSR, was willing to use military force to stop countries breaking away from communism, strengthening Soviet control over the Eastern Bloc. Okay, so if this is an 8-mark question overall, this would probably get your full 4 marks for that first paragraph. They're capped at 4. Each individual one. Okay, so let's look at consequence 2. Same process. Introduction of the Brezhnev Doctrine is the one we chose for this one. Another consequence of the Prague Spring was the introduction of the Brezhnev Doctrine. There's your point. Well, there's our evidence. After the invasion of Czechoslovakia, the Soviet Union announced that it had the right to intervene in any communist country where communism was under threat. So here we got some places. We've got some events with what they announced. Okay. Explanation. What happened as a result of this? This doctrine justified future Soviet intervention and made it clear that Eastern European countries did not have full independence. You could just as easily put as a result in there if you want to really think of a good linking phrase. And then, again, at the end, as a result, communist governments across Eastern Europe became more cautious and less willing to introduce reforms. So this links it back to the beginning. It's an overall impact. Okay, so that would get full marks, or probably at least 7 out of 8. So top level answer. So why would it do that? Well, it explains 2 clear consequences. Introduction of the Brezhnev Doctrine and reduction of freedoms. Each paragraph focuses on a cause and effect. Specific detail was used with Dubček, the invasion, and the Brezhnev Doctrine. So specific terminology, that's very important that you put that in. Examiners love that. There's no narrative or description. Everything is explained, but we are doing, because that's a problem. Sometimes students confuse the narrative account question with this one. Clear paragraphing and accurate terminology. So the thing this is a little student checklist that I like to put in on here. Ask yourself these questions. When you're sitting in the exam and you think you're done, just ask yourself these questions. Have I written 2 paragraphs, first of all? That's a big one. Is each paragraph about a different consequence? Very important. Don't write 2 paragraphs on the same consequence. Have I explained how the Prague Spring caused it? And have I explained why it mattered? Okay. Check those things and you should do rather well. Okay, now we are moving on to the narrative account. This is one that students really seem to struggle with, but it's really not that much different than your explain question that you have on, I think, paper 3. It's just that everything has to follow chronological order, and you should have some connectives. All right. So what we have here is write a narrative account analyzing U.S.-Soviet relations in the years of 1945 to 1947. So you're kind of telling a story, but you're telling a structured story. So they give you some bullet points. You may use the following in your answer. the Yalta Conference of February 1945, and Common Form of 1947. Now, again, you don't have to use the bullet points they give. I recommend students that they do, but that's up to you. You must also use information of your own. So the wording of this is very similar to what you do on the other papers for your explain question. It's just this has to follow chronological order and you have to show a relationship from one to the other. Okay. How do we answer this question? Let's break this down. Your command word is write a narrative account analyzing. So this means you must write in chronological order, like I said. Explain how relations changed over time. Show links between events. Include analysis, not just description. You are not explaining causes or consequences separately. You are telling the story of relationships developing and worsening. Okay. So what the bullet points mean. So the question says you may use the following in your answer. Like I said, the Yalta Conference, Common Form. You must also use information of your own. So this means you should include Yalta and Common Form. You don't have to. If you can come up with other ones, that's fine. You must include other events. So for example, you could use Potsdam, you could use the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, or anything else you can think of that you can link along here. You do not have to include everything. Only explain, only what helps explain relations. All right. So how to answer this? Step one, start in 1945 with the Yalta Conference. Begin by explaining the state of U.S.-Soviet relations at the end of World War II. That relations were cooperative but tense. Okay, so at Yalta, the USA and the USSR agreed on the defeat of Germany, what was going to happen after Germany was defeated, the division of Germany, free elections in Eastern Europe. There was disagreement. Stalin did not want that. And then analysis. Explain that although cooperation existed, differences in ideology, capitalism versus communism, caused mistrust from the start. We also had a couple of the world leaders that didn't get along too well. Okay, step two, show deterioration later in 1945. Okay, bring in Potsdam Conference of July of 1945. Truman replaces Roosevelt. Roosevelt died. The USA tests the atomic bomb. This increases tension in the Soviet Union. There were disagreements over Germany and reparations. Okay, so your analysis. Explain how relations worsened as Truman was less willing to compromise. Truman did not trust Stalin. Roosevelt was willing to work with him. Didn't particularly like him, but he's like, I can work with this guy. Truman, no, did not trust Stalin as far as he could throw him. Stalin felt threatened by U.S. nuclear power, the fact that we started the atomic bomb, and we'd shown that we would use it on Japan in World War II. And this shows change over time, which Edexcel rewards. Okay, step three. Develop tension in 1946 and 1947. So what happened? Further develop that. This is your own knowledge. You could include the Truman Doctrine from 1947. USA promised to stop the spread of communism. The Marshall Plan in 1947. Economic aid to Europe to actually help the Truman Doctrine, the promises made in the Truman Doctrine. And then your analysis. Explain that the USSR saw these attempts to spread capitalism. Stalin believed that the USA was interfering in Eastern Europe. And with Common Form in 1947. So you can explain Common Form was created by Stalin to control communist parties, strengthen Soviet control in Eastern Europe, and then a bit of analysis. Show that Common Form increased division, confirm the breakdown of cooperation, mark the clear beginning of the Cold War. Okay, so what is Edexcel looking for in this? Each paragraph should be in chronological order. Explain what happened. Explain how it affected relations. and think event, reaction, impact on relations. Okay? What not to do. Do not jump backwards and forwards in time. Do not write a list of events. They hate that. Do not explain causes in isolation, and do not ignore the bullet points. That last one, if you can come up with 2 other bullet points, you can. I highly recommend you don't, though. I highly recommend you use the bullet points given. Okay? Your examiner checklist. Before you finish, check, have I written in time order, 1945 to 1947? Have I included Yalta and Common Form? Have I added my own knowledge? Have I explained how relations change? And have I linked the events together? Okay, so here's some suggestions to help link. Use phrases like, this increased tension because. As a result, that's very useful in the last one, relations worsened. This showed that cooperation had broken down. And this shows analysis, which is essential for top-level marks. All right. So what does this look like? It looks like this. U.S.-Soviet relations in the years of 1945 to 1947 deteriorated from wartime cooperation into growing tension and mistrust, leading to the early stages of the Cold War. In February 1945, relations between the USA and the Soviet Union were still cooperative, as shown at the Yalta Conference. Both sides agreed on the need to defeat Nazi Germany and to divide Germany into zones of occupation after the war. However, there were already disagreements. The USA wanted free elections in Eastern Europe, while Stalin wanted to maintain Soviet influence and to create a buffer zone for security. Although compromises were reached, these differences highlighted the contrasting aims of the 2 superpowers and created underlying tension. Okay, so there's your paragraph on the Yalta Conference. Now, relations worsened later in 1945 at the Potsdam Conference. So they put Potsdam in as their own knowledge. Okay, and you're seeing that relations worsened later. That's connecting Potsdam to Yalta. By this time, President Truman had replaced Roosevelt and took a firmer stance against the Soviet Union. Okay, so there's your analysis. That's why they worsened. The USA successfully tested the atomic bomb. Again, more evidence as to why they worsened, which increased Soviet suspicion and fear. Disagreements over how Germany should be treated, particularly over reparations, further damaged relations. As a result, cooperation began to break down as each side increasingly mistrusted the other's intentions. Okay, so you can see what it talks about relations worsened later in 1945. So it's later is giving you that time reference. And then you've got all these reasons as to why it worsened. Okay, tensions increased further in 1947. Dates are very useful, especially shown in chronological order, with the introduction of the Truman Doctrine. Okay, here we go. That's why they increased even further. And the Marshall Plan. These 2 things were introduced, and that made matters even worse. The Truman Doctrine, now they're explaining what each of these are, or the effect they had. The Truman Doctrine committed the USA to stopping the spread of communism, which the Soviet Union viewed as a direct threat. The Marshall Plan offered economic aid to European countries, but Stalin believed it was an attempt to spread American influence and capitalism. Consequently, the USSR rejected the aid and forced Eastern European countries to do the same, deepening the division between East and West. Okay, so you're explaining what these are. You're explaining the effect that they had with the Marshall Plan. Stalin was feared that the USA was spreading capitalism. The Truman Doctrine, Soviet Union viewed that as a threat. And what happened as a result? Stalin forbade any of the Eastern countries from accepting Marshall aid, and the divisions increased. Okay, this division was reinforced later in 1947 with the creation of Common Form. Stalin set up Common Form to tighten control over communist parties in Eastern Europe and ensure loyalty to Moscow. This action showed that the Soviet Union was determined to resist American influence and maintain control over its sphere of influence. By the end of 1947, cooperation had ended and relations between the USA and the Soviet Union had clearly deteriorated, marking the beginning of the Cold War. Okay, so again, this division was reinforced later. Okay, so you've got all these time references in 1947, but with 1947, you're talking about what common form was. It was set up to tighten control, and then the effect that it had. Cooperation had completely ended, and we've got the Cold War beginning. Okay, model answer. Perfect. Clear chronological structure, which is essential for a narrative. Okay, answer moves logically through the period of 1945 to 1947. So you got February with the Yalta Conference, later in 1945 with Potsdam, and then in 1947, Truman Doctrine Marshall Plan, and later Common Form. This is a clear sequence showing structure, chronological understanding, which is key requirement for the top level. Strong sense of deterioration over time. The question asks how relationships deteriorated from growing tension and mistrust. The answer correctly starts with cooperation in Yalta, moves to growing disagreement, develops into open suspicion and hostility, ends with the clear division and the start of the Cold War. Each paragraph builds on the last, showing progression. Events are linked by cause and consequence. This is what really lifts it to a model answer. Examples: Yalta disagreements lead to underlying tension, which lead to Truman replacing Roosevelt. Well, Truman replaces Roosevelt, plus the atomic bomb, and that leads to worsened mistrust. Then you have the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan, which enhances that Soviet fear of U.S. influence. You've got the Marshall Plan, which leads to the creation of Common Form as a direct response. This shows the student understands why one event led to the next, which Edexcel will reward. You've got accurate and relevant knowledge. So the answer includes key conferences, Yalta, Potsdam, key individuals, Truman and Stalin, policies, Truman Doctrine and Marshall Plan, and organizations, which is the creation of Common Form. All information is accurate, relevant, and well selected. No unnecessary detail or errors. And focus stays tightly on the question. Examiners hate it when you go off on tangents. The student never drifts into an explanation of Cold War in general. Everything is clearly linked to how and why relations deteriorated between 1945 and 1947. This tight focus is exactly what examiners look for. If you think the more you write, the higher mark you're going to get, it's a myth. Okay, effective concluding judgment. So the final sentence: by the end of 1947, cooperation had ended and relations had clearly deteriorated, marking the beginning of the Cold War. So this summarizes the narrative. It reinforces the idea of change over time, clearly answers the question. And narrative answers don't need evaluation, but they do need a clear endpoint, which this provides. Okay, so according to the Edexcel GCSE history marks scheme, this response would be placed in full mark, level 4, full marks, because it is well organized and chronological, shows clear links between events, explains how cooperation turned into conflict, covers the entire time period, so don't leave anything out and don't go over the time period, and uses accurate and relevant historical knowledge. Okay, final question. There's only actually 3 questions on this paper. They're just lengthy questions to write on. And this is a 16 marker, but you have to explain 2 of the 3 options given. Okay, so you've got 3 choices here. The importance of the Yalta Conference, February 1945, for relations between East and West. Okay, so it doesn't just say explain the Yalta Conference. It's very specific in terms of East-West relations, or the importance, or I should say, the importance of Khrushchev's Berlin ultimatum in 1958 for tension between East and West. Okay, or I should say, the importance of SALT I for relations between the USA and the Soviet Union in the 1970s. Okay, so these are not that difficult. So you're going to pick two. You're going to write 2 paragraphs for each one. So it's going to be a total of 4 paragraphs for a total of 16 marks. Okay, so your model answer. So the first one that has been chosen for the model answer is the importance of the Yalta Conference for relations between East and West. Okay, so the Yalta Conference was important for relations between East and West because it showed both cooperation and underlying tension between the USA and the Soviet Union at the end of the Second World War. At Yalta, the Big Three agreed to divide Germany into 4 zones of occupation and to work together to defeat Nazi Germany. This cooperation helped maintain positive relations in the short term and suggested that wartime alliance could continue after the war. However, Yalta is also important because it exposed growing disagreements that later damaged relations. The USA and Britain wanted free elections in Eastern Europe, while Stalin wanted to create a buffer zone of pro-Soviet states to protect the USSR from future invasion. Although Stalin promised free elections, he later failed to keep his promise, which increased mistrust. This meant that Yalta created expectations that were not met, leading to tension. Overall, Yalta was important because it marked the last moment of genuine cooperation between East and West, while also laying the foundations for later conflict. This compromises hid deep ideological differences, which soon became clear and contributed to the development of the Cold War. All right. Second one, the importance of Khrushchev's Berlin ultimatum for tension between East and West. Okay, so Khrushchev's Berlin ultimatum was important because it significantly increased tensions between East and West over the future of Germany and Berlin. In 1958, Khrushchev demanded that the Western powers withdraw from West Berlin, threatening to hand control of access routes to East Germany. This alarmed the USA and its allies, as West Berlin was a symbol of freedom and democracy within communist East Germany. The ultimatum was important because it led to a series of international crises and meetings that failed to resolve the issue. The USA refused to leave West Berlin, increasing hostility and mistrust between the superpowers. The ongoing tension eventually contributed to the construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961, which physically divided East and West Berlin. Overall, the Berlin Ultimatum was important because it showed how divided Europe had become and how close Cold War tensions were to open conflict. It deepened confrontation between the superpowers and highlighted Berlin as a major Cold War flashpoint. All right. So why is this a model answer? We're going to look at the Yalta one because we really only have to explain one of these. So response stays consistent, focused on importance, because the other one does the same thing, not just description. Clear understanding of relations between East and West, not just events at Yalta. Okay, so again, don't just explain the importance of the Yalta Conference overall. You have to explain it in terms of East-West relations. So, opening paragraph about cooperation. The Yalta Conference was important for relations between East and West because it showed both cooperation and underlying tension between the USA and the Soviet Union. So, what did the examiner say about that? Strong opening that directly addresses why Yalta mattered, identifies cooperation as an important factor and shows balance, sets up a clear line of argument for the rest of the answer, and this links to the mark scheme, demonstrates clear explanation of importance, which is a requirement if you want to crack that top level. Okay, accurate knowledge. At Yalta, the Big Three agreed to divide Germany into 4 zones of occupation. So, what did the examiner say about that? Accurate, relevant, factual knowledge. Details are used to support the explanation and not just listed. Show secure understanding of the conference outcomes. And how does that link to the mark scheme? It supports explanation with precise, contextual knowledge. And development and detention. However, Yalta was also important because it exposed growing disagreements. So, what does the examiner say about that? Clear shift from cooperation to tension. Excellent narrative logic. Focuses on why disagreements mattered for relations, not just what they were. Shows awareness of ideological differences. And this links to the mark scheme. Explains how and why relations were affected, not just what happened. Okay, broken promises and consequences. Although Stalin promised free elections, he later failed to keep his promise. So, what does the examiner say? Excellent explanation of cause and consequence. Clearly links Yalta's decisions to later mistrust. Shows how Yalta contributed to long-term deterioration. And the mark scheme link. Clear explanation of importance over time. And judgment and conclusion. Overall, Yalta was important because it marked the last moment of genuine cooperation. So, what does the examiner say? Strong overall judgment, not just a summary. Directly answers the question by weighing cooperation versus conflict. Shows sophistication expected at the top level. And sustained explanation plus supported judgment. So that is essential for level 4, a mark of 7 or 8. Okay, overall, why does this answer get full marks? Focused on importance throughout, explains short and long-term impact, accurate, relevant knowledge, there's a clear judgment, no narrative drift. So the final examiner decision was level 4, 8 out of 8. Okay, that is the end of the exam walkthrough. It is quite a short paper. Remember, this is only half of the paper 2. We will do the other half of paper 2 with the British depth study at the end of the British depth study. So I hope this was helpful. I will include a past paper as the worksheet this time so you can work through the questions and even set timings for yourself if you like. Okay, everybody, thank you again, and I will see you on the next study. Enjoy studying.